light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. With me today on the show, I have my friend Vendella Sawyer, and the topic we picked for today was to discuss creative approaches to communal challenges. Probably the most striking example I've heard of in recent history is, I don't know if it's still considered an experiment or if it's a stable, ongoing sort of societal resource, but in the Netherlands, they have created a town, if I pronounce it correctly, I think it's called Hogewijk, or Hogewijk, I'm not sure exactly there, but it's basically this self-contained village of sorts. I mean, it's a totally closed-in area that's locked off from the world around it. It's specifically for people dealing with advanced stages of dementia. People who cannot, for their own safety, be out in the community at large anymore, but rather than institutionalize them in a traditional sense, they have built this little village where the people live and can go to a grocery store and a barber and all the usual things that you would have in a town, except what is the secret part of it, I guess, is that the staff of all these different things in this little village of Hogewijk are all trained medical professionals, trained to deal with people with dementia. And so they can go get the groceries, or they can go get a haircut, or they can do all the usual things they would do in normal life, except there's no money exchanged. They get whatever they need, so there's no money to keep track of, there's no money to forget. They get their food, they get their laundry done, they get whatever is needed. It's just, it's daily life, but it's maintained in a way that even if they forget everything or get lost or suddenly need support, every single person working inside there is a trained medical person ready to deal with the situation.
You wouldn't say self-contained facility. It's a self-contained village.
Okay.
Where it's
because it really is a village.
It's a village. I mean, you have the qualified medical people there for them, but they're still able to live their lives independently.
Mm-hmm.
And they're able to, if they have need for medical needs, they're met right then and there. And it's something that kind of came out, not, in another aspect of it, back in the 60s.
In the 1960s?
Mm-hmm. Back in the 60s in New York, on Long Island. It was a developer came up with a self-contained apartment building complex in Long Island.
But it was never built here?
It was built in New York.
So New York does have one?
It wasn't just it was a community. And the community contained everybody with every walk of life, with every disability that was known. You had everything. You didn't have to leave the building.
Okay.
You had your barber, your grocery store, the shop, the dentist, everything. People to visit, activities. And if you did leave, you could leave with someone or leave escorted with someone.
Okay.
And it's like a self-contained bubble. It's one of the Star Trek movies, where in Star Trek Generation, not Star Trek Generation, the new Star Trek, there's this intergalactical space ball that's a globe, and it's just self-contained, sitting out in space. And it looks like a snow cone.
The Dyson Sphere.
Right. And
the Dyson Sphere.
So if you look
where they built literally it was a bubble built around a star so that they could utilize and capture 100% of the star's energy.
Right.
The problem was that as the star got older, it started to go into the usual life cycle of the star and started getting bigger, because eventually, if I remember my astronomy class correctly, stars, they get larger and become a red giant and then finally collapse into a black dwarf.
Now, you're talking about the older Star Trek. This is the new Star Trek.
This was Star Trek Next Generation.
No, this is Star Trek. This is the new Star Trek now. Goes back to Spock, Bones, and Captain Kirk when they
Okay.
were just coming out of space camping, and how they became captain and how their lives got changed. But
Okay.
in one of these series, there is a space ball. It is a snow globe, self-contained,
Okay.
not with a star. It has its own energy, its own atmosphere, everything. So
That must
this-
be one I missed then.
I'll
I
have to make-
apologize.
I'll have to see if I can get it for you. Well,
In any case,
in any case,
To get back to our-
is that this concept was not just created recently, but the concept kind of came out in the 60s
okay.
of a self-contained village, of where, you know, you lived in, let's say, a small town that was called Redenbach. Redenbach is a little small town, and there's 2,000 miles this way to get to the next town and 2,000 miles the other way to get to the other town. Everything was self-contained.
Okay.
But this concept is exactly the same thing. But it doesn't take the dignity or independence from
Okay.
these people would have issues or don't have issues.
So
And
the
even
difference between that and Hogewick is that the people living in Hogewick would not be allowed to leave the facility.
They're allowed to leave the facility if they can, if they want to there. But,
Oh, they are.
But
Okay. I
see,
misunderstood then.
it's not just to that fact. It's like you have a shadow.
I have a shadow, you said?
A shadow.
Okay.
Okay, you're a person that can go out into the community, leave, go visit, and come back. But just to make sure you're okay, not knowing.
Oh, you mean a person who shadows you?
Yeah, that you don't. That's not there. That's interrupting you or watching you every 25 seconds. They know where you are, what's going on, and what contact, if anything happens, and to come and help you if you're needed.
Kind of like a chaperone or
Yeah, it's a chaperone, but a chaperone that stays away. It's like having
a
security.
chaperone that only watches and doesn't interfere.
Nothing, unless needed.
Okay. That makes sense.
So they may send 4 or 5 people out at one time, and they have 2 assistants that are there. And people they know they're there, but they're so used to going out by themselves, they don't worry about it unless something does happen. They know
Okay.
it is there for them, like having a panic button.
Well, it's a resource rather than a limitation.
Right. And I
Um,
think it's a great
in
idea.
Another recent conversation we had, we were talking about problems of family units and how if there were situations in which youth were erroneously reporting abuse that wasn't actually happening, and how to create some accountability and some trust and some self-discipline around that situation. I mean, I think self-discipline is probably the most valuable thing any parent can give their child. On the flip side of that, I don't know if we adequately touched on it, is if somebody finds themselves in a situation where there really is abuse going on, and they're trying to get help, but people won't answer. And you and I both had experiences trying to do that where we didn't get the response we needed and the people weren't helped. One of the ways, at least in this country, it seems that when the government doesn't do the job and when the systems don't work, one of the ways that seems to be common here is to create a nonprofit organization to address that specific need in an independent sort of fashion, which is laudable and wonderful when it works, but there's different pitfalls of these organizations according to who gets on the board of directors. As I understand it, the first thing, having been through a couple nonprofit organizations myself, the first thing you have to come up with is articles of incorporation and bylaws, where you are basically identifying yourself to state and federal governments and listing out to what standards or policies or goals or whatever you will be accountable. The problem is that then you have to get people on your board of directors, and if you're really, really, really lucky,
Yes.
you get a really good board of directors. But there are a lot of board of directors where people with hidden agendas manage to get on the board. And all sorts of power plays result, which is where the first one I ever set up, I spent 3 months writing the bylaws because I wanted to write them so that they would not be micromanaging, but also so that the organization could not be hijacked. A friend of mine worked with a senior senator in Wyoming, I believe it was.
Yes.
And somebody got into that with an agenda and basically sabotaged the whole thing to where it became almost impossible to operate the senior center anymore because it wasn't doing the purpose for which it was created, and it was sabotaging. It was so ego-driven that it sabotaged all. It alienated the funders and sabotaged the funding, and ultimately they had to close their doors because they couldn't keep operating.
Which was wrong, which was bad for the people that it was supposed to be there to help.
Yeah, because the seniors didn't have a senior center then at that point. All because there was somebody who got in, messed with it too much. I mean, the other thing that you have to watch out for, and it happens again and again in nonprofits, is what some people call cooking the books.
Yes, that happens quite a bit.
You know, that because everything donated to this organization is tax exempt, it becomes a way of, as they say, laundering money.
But that does not make it right.
Does not make it right, and it leaves the nonprofits with the challenge of how do I fund my organization without touching what might be called dirty money, and how do we report everything, all the money that comes in, all the money that goes out. If, for example, a nonprofit is dealing with grant-oriented organizations, there is a certain process. In my understanding, it usually starts with someone saying, we have a grant available. Nonprofits then contact them with a grant application, saying, this is what we want to do, this is what we're going to spend it on, this is the calendar of when these things are going to happen. It's all written out.
Yeah, but you run into issues like in smaller communities and even in the city,
Okay?
where you run into, well, what do you call it, the old boy or old school thing, where you wash my hand, I wash your
Cronyism?
hand. Yes. And when it comes to the point, like if you have a small nonprofit organization that's doing something for children and adults, and this larger nonprofit comes to you and says, listen, we would like to offer you X amount of dollars. And you fill out the application. And they've already told you in writing, well, we're going to give you the money X amount at this particular date. And that particular date goes by, and you call in, talk to them, and ask them, well, what's the problem? Is there something I didn't do right? And they says, well, we need you to fill out the application again. And my question is, if the application was not filled out right in the beginning, why did I have to wait until I contacted you before you informed me?
Yeah,
of
it should have been a rejected application.
Right.
And if there was no rejected application, it implies that it was acceptable, but again, if you put dates and conditions and specifics in that document, I mean, that's a legal contract.
Right, but
So if they don't follow through, they're in breach of contract.
they shouldn't be in breach of contract. They broke the law.
And there has to be that sort of
But
accountability.
then you also have to take into conception on the overall basis of our government as it's ran now. Okay?
I'm not sure what you mean by that. You mean the state government or the federal
No, I'm
government?
talking, you have to take into consideration the actions of the United States government,
The federal
the
government?
federal government, the state governments, and then when you get into the lower part of the counties, and then to the cities themselves.
So you've got 4 different branches of government to
there's
satisfy.
just these things that are going on, and so much bureaucracy, and so much paperwork. But what the problem starts with is when it becomes personal, when it's no longer about the organization, when
Which, when you get right down to the bottom level, is where a lot of that can happen at the local level. But the problem there is making or keeping everybody accountable to all these other levels that have gotten involved. That what you do at the local level cannot contradict what the federal government requires.
Right, of course not.
And when it does, it places everybody in jeopardy. And so that's where it becomes really important to consider issues of liability.
You have to consider the conditions of liability. But what should have not happened, should not happen at all is that when that organization has not came to you for the grant, you offered it to them. And then you offered these dates that they were going to receive it. And then because of something that might have been said personally to this person or to another person, and that foundation's board listens to 2 or 3 people on that board and tries to start questioning what they offered is wrong. That's on a personal basis then.
So the first warning flag is that the grant was offered before the application was received. That's totally improper procedure.
The money was offered saying we have this and you can apply for it. That's the usual way it goes.
Okay, so then
Okay,
the
so-
grant application is sent in,
And it's sent in. And
specify certain dates,
that's right.
and if those dates pass without anything happening, you have no contract.
Right. But then the organization that offered you the money, the grant, says, well, excuse me, we're sorry. We didn't get back with you, but there was a few things you missed on your application. I mean, you should have
Well, then send a rejected application.
correct, but you don't send a rejected application. They ask you to refill out the application and then give you a letter of, well, you missed this and you missed that.
To me, it sounds like they're lobbying for too much control.
Right, and then there are certain things that each organization, I mean, there are things that are public that you're entitled to read at any place and any time, being a nonprofit.
Yeah. Bylaws and articles of incorporation are public records.
Okay, and then there's things that have nothing to do with your grant and nothing to do with what you're donating to that you have no business having to know.
Well, and that's where, having been on a few boards, if someone was trying to exert that kind of control over the activities of a board I was on, I would refuse to do any further business with them. I mean, it would be as inappropriate as having a car salesman tell you that you really don't want the green car, you want the red one. And it's not your choice. I'm the one who's going to be paying the bill. I get to decide what color I want my car to be. I mean, it becomes, in a sense, a two-headed monster,
Yes.
because there is something,
Wrong with one of the heads.
there is something making decisions and exerting control, and it becomes kind of a power grab in a way. But the problem with that is that when everything, if the federal government suddenly says you haven't followed your bylaws and your articles of incorporation properly, this other person has no risk involved. It's your nonprofit that's going to be totally at risk for being shut down by the federal government.
Right, so you have to protect yourself.
You have to figure out where the liability lies, but in the midst of all that, not forgetting what the purpose of the organization is.
Right.
That it's not to have an organization, it's to serve a need. And if that need is not being served, then all this paperwork and bureaucracy is totally meaningless, and there's no reason anyone should put up with the struggle, because it's not getting you anywhere.
Well, I'd like to make another point on that. I don't think that another nonprofit organization that has made a sincere donation or offer to you at some time and point think that they should control your organization when they're the ones that came to you to make the offer
Yeah, there's no basis for that.
at all. I mean,
But behind it all, we still have this challenge of, we have communities, we have needs, we need to get these needs met, and if the government isn't going to do it for us, and if United Way or the Red Cross or whoever you want to name isn't going to do it for us, we need to get off our butts and get the job done.
ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it kind of goes back to that old adage, if you want something done right,
You have to do it yourself. But I'm like, I feel this, that it's a learning process. Just like when you said you were writing your grants and it took you 3 months to get your bylaws.
Mhm.
It's a learning process.
Yeah, I mean,
And
I
with all
studied those, every point I wrote, I cross-examined and I questioned, who could take advantage of this? How could it be misused? Is it an appropriate balance of power? Does it compromise self-agency? I mean, all the questions you can imagine.
Well, see, that's where it comes in good to have someone that thinks the way you do
Hmm.
in a particular nonprofit organization. For those that think of these things, but not all of them. You know, so that you know, because even if you get a lawyer, you know, he's
Well,
getting
I think
paid.
I had a lawyer and 4 different friends look at it for me during that time.
Right. But
Because I wanted them to tell me what's wrong with it. I don't want compliments. I don't want validation. I want you to look at the content and tell me where it's weak.
right.
I want to know how I can do better. You know, so many times people are so worried about ego issues that they withhold the truth.
Right.
And I can't effectively respond to anything but the truth.
That's all, what we all should respond to is the truth.
But what gets even more insidious is when people with ego issues are specifically manipulating others into lying to them. You know, basically telling them, I can't accept any answer except the one I want to hear, so you have to lie to me so that we can get along.
Well, that's when you have to step back and think for yourself.
You have to step back and think for yourself, but you also have to realize that if you follow them down that path, you will wind up with the same negative consequence toward which they are headed.
Right.
And, you know, if someone is busy sinking their boat, why do you want to get on board?
Correct. And if someone is sinking that boat, they need to be off that board or boat.
Well, yeah, and you need to get off of it in a way that you sever your ties to responsibility for what happened to the boat.
Right.
You know, documenting that you were not there when somebody drilled a hole through the floor or whatever. You know, that your fingerprints are not on the drill, that, you know, whatever constitutes evidence in your particular case.
And that it's assured that what is discussed in that organization stays within that organization and not publicly announced so that everyone else knows about it. I mean, if they want to know it, they can go and get the records and the statements and the bylaws for that. I mean, you have small towns.
Well, it's the question of appropriate accountability.
Right. I agree.
Appropriate confidentiality.
Right.
And that if you're doing it as an organization or as a board, everything, I mean, that's the whole point for having minutes of meetings, so that we all remember the same thing 2 months from now, rather than having 3 different stories of what happened
Well,
at that
do
meeting.
you think that there should be a disclosure with boards on what is discussed and what can be discussed outside that board?
I don't know if disclosure is the right word, but some sort of notice of, I guess I wouldn't forbid any discussion outside, but everyone has to understand that outside of the official meetings or outside of the directives formed at official meetings, no one is authorized to speak on behalf of the organization. No one represents the organization. No one embodies the organization. The board of directors is the legal body of the nonprofit organization.
Right.
And you have to take that very seriously. And so even the president of the board, unless authorized by the board, cannot make statements on behalf of the board that are to which everyone else is supposed to be responsible.
Right.
And no member of the board could autocratically make a similar choice.
Right.
You know, unless the board has authorized them to do so, they do not represent the organization. They're simply a member of the board who can carry reports back and forth, who can engage in discussion, who can make comments, but there cannot be anything legally binding about any choice they make because they are not the embodiment of the organization.
Well, how do we correct that when those things are happening now, you know, everywhere? I mean,
The first thing I would point to is correcting the bylaws, because these are the sorts of checks and balances that need to be written into your bylaws.
right.
If they are not there, then it kind of falls to the community, the surrounding community, to either withdraw all support and disband that organization, or let the organization fall for lack of support, and create a new one that has correctly written bylaws.
Well, what about some accountability? I believe there should be some accountability.
The bylaws is where I would put the accountability.
Accountability.
You know, that decisions of the board must be made by 2/3, for example. the president is not authorized to do anything more than break a tie vote.
That's right.
You know, whatever restrictions or empowerments anyone wants, you can write bylaws any way you want. There's complete freedom. Well, I would say there's complete freedom, but I'm not an attorney. I'm sure there are certain legal restrictions around it. But they are so, to me, they are so broad that you can, whatever process you create, if it is a fair and democratic process, I can't imagine the federal or state government saying no. But when you form an organization, it will be submitted for their review. If they have a problem, they will tell you.
I just believe that we, as a people, need to be more responsible in our decisions when we join organizations and have a full understanding of what our goals are. And we can get off track as being human beings about things. But once something is presented to us, where we see that it's been wrong, it's time to be corrected, that needs to be corrected as quickly as possible for the sake of the organization and the people that the organization was created to help.
Exactly.
And I think that that's in all organizations, in a corporation, from any type of corporation, even a company.
Well, and my final comment would be that regardless of how complicated and bureaucratic all of this is, it is a tool that can be used, that can work to make the world a better place.
Right.
But we have to do due diligence in order to make sure that, you know, as they say, anything worth doing is worth doing right.
Right.
So that's the commitment we have to hold ourselves to.
Well, my comment is remember to don't stop with the nonprofits because that's what helps the world go around nowadays. And that do your thorough study before you get started. And what you don't know, find the right information and the right person to get it from.
The information's there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your input.
I enjoyed this.
Thank you for watching.